Hi, my name is Shahera Hyatt, and I'm the director of the California Homeless Youth Project. And our goal is to educate policymakers on the needs of young people experiencing homelessness throughout the state of California. So basically, I read, write, and talk a lot about youth homelessness. And today what I'm going to be doing is sharing a little bit about what youth homelessness is in San Francisco, in California, and beyond. Well, we tend to think of anybody who's lacking a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. That's the definition that the Department of Education uses to talk about student homelessness, that we tend to think of as the most inclusive definition of the range of experiences that young people and their families often have when it comes to homelessness. So that can look like staying in hotels or motels, living in a car, staying in emergency shelter or transitional housing, living outside, or very commonly living doubled or tripled up, or couch surfing is another way to put that. Nationally, about 1.3 million students experienced homelessness at some point during the 2016-17 school year, and that's using the definition that I was just speaking about. California has about 260,000 of those students nationally. So we're really overrepresented in terms of how many young people, how many students really are experiencing homelessness in our state. A national study out of Chapin Hall, Missed Opportunities, found that for young people under the ages of 18, 1 in 30 minors experienced homelessness at some point during the past year. And for young people ages 18 to 24, 1 in 10 of those young people experienced homelessness at some point during the year. So let's start with a very brief overview of the history of homelessness in the United States. So we tend to think of two major episodes of homelessness that occurred during the 20th century. You can pause it right now if you want to have a discussion about what those are, or I'll just tell you. So the first episode that we tend to think of was during the Great Depression, and that's when we created the U.S. Housing Authority Act, which was the precursor to HUD. And that's when we decided that investing in public affordable housing was a shared national value. The next episode that we tend to think of is during the recession of the 1980s. During that time, from 1978 to 1983, HUD's budget was decimated. They lost almost 80%, about 77% of their funding during that 5-year recession period. And that's when we developed a fragmented crisis response system, never again investing in public affordable housing in the meaningful way that we once had. So I just want to say that this is a really brief overview. And then the most recent one that we tend to think of now in the 21st century is the Great Recession of 2008, right? When during the foreclosure crisis, a lot of people lost their homes and were pushed into the rental market, which has become an extremely tight market. We know that rents are increasing across the country and across the state, and that this is leading really to displacement and gentrification of a lot of our low-income neighbors. So nationally, there are about only 37 households for every 100 low-income renters. In California, that number is as low as 22. So there are only 22 places to stay or units of housing for every 100 people that are looking for them. So we know that California has a massive housing shortage. And that's particularly true when we think of low income and affordable and extremely affordable housing, as well as market rate housing. The thing that we seem to have not only enough of, but really too much of, is luxury and above market rate housing. California ranks 50th in the country in terms of housing affordability. Right now, as of 2019, we know that homelessness in San Francisco has gone up about 17% since 2017. And that's according to the point in time count, which is an annual sort of census of people that are living outside. Almost 20% of those folks identified were youth and young adults, so about 18, 19% of the homeless population in San Francisco is young people. When we look at student homelessness in San Francisco, they identified a little over 2,500 students as experiencing homelessness at some point in the 2015-16 school year. We did some research to evaluate how many programs across the state of California there are to actually serve young people experiencing homelessness. And what we found is that 2/3 of California's 58 counties actually had zero programs for youth and young adults experiencing homelessness. And I think that's really important to mention because it sort of challenges some of the ideas that we have about youth and young adults experiencing homelessness, and sometimes the perception that there is an element of choice. But we know it's not really a choice when there are no other alternatives. We also know that youth homelessness exists in suburban, urban, and rural areas, so it's not just a San Francisco and Los Angeles problem. This is something that happens across the state. In fact, when we looked at student homelessness in California, 3 of the 5 counties with the highest percentages of student homelessness were actually rural counties. So even though some of the sheer numbers are bigger in our urban areas, some of the percentages in rural areas are about the same. And that's really because of the lack of housing, transportation, and supportive services that also exist in our rural communities. California has the benefit of having good data on college students experiencing homelessness. So we know that 1 in 20 UC students, 1 in 10 CSU students, and 1 in 5 community college students experienced homelessness at some point over the past year. So these young people are very likely to report family conflict, much of which is exacerbated by poverty. And I say that because if you're a family that's already living in substandard, overcrowded housing, and you get kicked out of your place to stay, and you go to live with another family who's also living in substandard, overcrowded housing, conflict and tensions are going to be high, right? If we don't have the benefit of having a room to cool off in, when we get into a fight with our sibling or our caregiver, it's just much harder to rebound from those situations when your material needs aren't being met, when you haven't slept well, when you don't have regular access to food, or you don't know how long you can stay at this house that you're temporarily staying at. And I say that because I think sometimes when we hear the phrase couch surfing, we think, oh, that's easy, you just staying on somebody's couch. But what we know it looks like in real life for people is often a lot more challenging than that. We also know that these young people are far more likely to be physically or sexually victimized than their peers, and many homeless youth are victimized repeatedly. And this is a big reason why trauma is so high for this community. So these young people are much more likely to report post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and suicidality. These young people are also 3 times more likely to be pregnant and parenting than their housed peers. They also have difficulty finding employment and often turn to the street economy as a way to make money. So whether it looks like trading sex for a place to stay, or drugs for socks, honestly, these decisions are really about the ladders of opportunity that are available to young people. So when we don't help to meet young people's basic needs, they're very resilient and will find a way, right? It's not about the difference between knowing the difference between right and wrong. It's really about what opportunities are available. And that's something that's on all of us to make sure there are more opportunities for young people to thrive in ways that are safe for them and for the community. So the causes of homelessness are often linked to trauma, like family conflict, system failure, not having your basic needs met. But also just an episode of homelessness in and of itself is a traumatic event. Trauma also changes the way our brains work, and that's particularly true the younger that we are. And that changes our reactions to stress. So that can look like being hypervigilant, or not responding well to authority. Sometimes people say oppositional or defiant. But really, these are perfectly predictable responses to trauma for young people. So we want our responses to these young folks to be healing rather than re-traumatizing. So punitive responses tend to be more re-traumatizing, and empathetic responses tend to be more healing. So things like trauma-informed care, harm reduction, restorative justice, these are all practices, really best practices in our field. So we know that 20 to 40% of young people experiencing homelessness identify as being members of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer and questioning community. This is due to oftentimes rejection because of their sexual orientation or gender identity from their caregivers or sometimes even the systems that they're involved in. About 25 to 40% of LGBT youth who are experiencing homelessness say that they were kicked out because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And that means that about 60 to 75% are homeless for the same reasons a lot of other young people are experiencing homelessness: family homelessness, and the inability to afford and maintain rent, the lack of appropriate mental health and substance use treatment, and discrimination really in all of our systems, including education, juvenile justice, child welfare, and certainly employment. Youth who are Black and LGBT report the highest rates of homelessness, and it's also worth mentioning that Black and Native American youth nationally and in California are overrepresented among young people experiencing homelessness, again because of discrimination within our homelessness services system and all other systems that touch young people and their families. So I just want to say a few words on resiliency. These young people experiencing homelessness are often bursting at the seams with their ideas to change the world to be a better place, not just for themselves, but for other young people like them and for other people who are struggling and living in poverty and experiencing homelessness. And I say that because really listening to people who are most impacted by this crisis is probably the most helpful thing that we can do in trying to be of assistance to them and really trying to support the community. So these young people are often really driven, resourceful, and want to connect to community. That's what's happening for youth and young adults developmentally, and certainly for these young people, it's no exception. And we know that these experiences outside of the mainstream often give them different perspectives. I know that for me, in spending time with young people kind of across this housing crisis spectrum, that they're incredibly social justice oriented, intersectional. They know the gaps of the system because they have to really overcome them every single day. So we need to talk to young people about their ideas for change and about program development and really implementing, whether it's policy or programs. Young people really need to be at the center of that work. So research on trajectories into homelessness often look only at the individual. And while it's incredibly important to listen to the individual reasons for homelessness, sometimes that has the effect of absolving the system of our responsibility in responding to what is really a systemic crisis, not a personal failure. So when you ask a young person why they became homeless, most often nobody is going to say because of decades of federal disinvestment in affordable housing, right? We talk about conflict and don't always know the ways that we're really swept into the cracks of the systems that exist and fall through the holes in our meager safety net. So family rejection and conflict are not the only issues, though prevention and reunification are incredibly important when that seems like a feasible option. And I say this to say that responsibility should not only lie with the individual or family, but with society and systems intended to protect them. We need to work hard to prevent homelessness by supporting families who are struggling economically or emotionally with supporting their child. We need to invest in homeless youth programs that use trauma-informed care, harm reduction services, and are low or no barrier. We need to ask young people experiencing homelessness what they need and then build programs to meet their needs. We need to eliminate punitive responses to homelessness, which disproportionately impact LGBT youth and youth of color, like the criminalization of homelessness. We need to look at policies with the lens of these youth and young adults and know that they need our protection. So sometimes if we're working on efforts related to juvenile justice or foster care, know that young people experiencing homelessness are a big part of that population as well, and that we all benefit from being more intersectional in our work. So these are people recommendations, right? We of course need to treat people experiencing homelessness with dignity and respect. And that may sound really obvious, but we know that that's not always the case out there. And that nobody's life is worth more or less than anybody else's, and certainly not based on your resources and what you have economically. All people are people, and we need to really start acting that way. We can also choose to share resources, whether that's your time or your money or your mentorship or your skills, thinking about how we can all be a part of this collective solution to what is really and truly a collective problem. We also need to challenge stereotypes about homelessness by choice. When we surveyed over 200 young people experiencing homelessness across the state of California, 90% said they wanted to change their housing situation. And we believe that the other 10% was so disenfranchised by the lack of support that it's a more dignified alternative to say that it's their choice to be homeless, rather than accept that there's really no support out there for them. We also have this really popular myth that people experiencing homelessness are coming from somewhere else. And what we know is that 70 to 80% of people experiencing homelessness in a given community are from that community. And that people without homes tend to migrate for the same reasons anybody else does, which is connections to jobs, family, and friends. There's so much room for us to make progress on the issue of youth homelessness in California and beyond, because we haven't historically invested in solutions and really holistic solutions to youth homelessness in our state. So before you leave today, I'd like to encourage you all to dream big and think about how you'd like to be part of a solution to end youth homelessness, even for one young person, and to write down that idea or to share it with somebody else that you're with today. Thanks so much.